Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Progressive American Report. I'm your host, Connor Kelly. Today I'm speaking with Ross Halperin, the author of Bear Witness, The Pursuit of Justice in a Violent Land. Thank you very much for joining me, sir.
Great to be here. Thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Absolutely. So to kind of start off simple, I wanted to get a perspective of like how you came to create this book. What about your personal experiences? What about your professional background really made you want to write this, and why the focus on Honduras?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of came out of the blue a little bit, sort of out of left field. I was working for these criminologists in New York, looking at the problems of impunity and crime and policing and incarceration here in the United States, and developing ways to try to improve those problems. And in the summer of 2017 or so, we got really interested in the problem of impunity here in the United States. And basically, this might surprise a lot of your listeners, but whereas in other wealthy democracies in, say, Europe or Asia, upwards of maybe 90% of homicides are solved, here in the United States, it's much lower than that. It's about 60%, and the solve rate for non-fatal shootings is even shamefully lower. And it's skewed. So in places like Chicago, the solve rate for murders might be something like 25% or 30%. So it's a great deal of impunity. And, I did a bunch of research, and the sort of capstone of that project was a summit that was organized in New York City by this guy called David Kennedy, who's a criminologist at John Jay. And one of the people who made a presentation at that summit was Kurt Verbeek. And as you know, Kurt is the subject of the book. And it was one of those moments where, I wasn't a journalist, I wasn't an author, but I just heard this incredible story that enthralled me. And I think it was, he was describing the program that they had invented down in Honduras. And that seemed like a really fascinating solution for the impunity problems here in the United States. And then also it was just like wow, like this person, like the risks he had taken, the life he had lived, the places he had gone. I was just so interested in him and why he had made those decisions. So that's how it all started. I shot him an email pretty soon thereafter and was just like, hey, can I write a magazine article about you? And a month or two later, I was in Honduras for the first time.
So to get into Mr. Verbeek's perspective, history and his background, when I was reading through it, it was kind of interesting to see this person who was very much into his traditional religious experience, coming from a Midwestern background, and who really didn't speak a lot of Spanish. Who goes from really marrying his wife Joanne, going to Costa Rica, and then not, even though they didn't speak a lick of Spanish,
Right.
to going into Honduras, and then eventually forming these organizations that were trying to help the people there. What about Honduras was really significant to Mr. Verbeek? What was your perspective in terms of how he told you the story? How did the locals react to his presence? And really, how did his faith play a role in the development of these organizations?
Yeah, I mean, look, him and his wife Joanne were these young, idealistic people who they didn't have a really strong vision for their lives, but they did have the sense that, like, we want to help people. And it really was by chance that they were offered a job in Costa Rica first. And then they came to really like the region and speaking Spanish. They learned it pretty quickly. They lived with a family. And then they got transferred to Honduras about 2 years later. And they just fell in love with it. And, if you're someone who does want to help the poor, it's a great place to be in the sense that, I think it's the poorest country in the hemisphere besides Haiti. And at the time, I mean, a lot of other countries in the region were at war. I mean, this was the 80s, the Cold War. So Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua were more dangerous places to be. And they fell in love with it. They just really connected with the people there. They had traveled to all those other countries, despite the problems I just mentioned, but really just connected with Hondurans and Honduras, and like pretty quickly decided that this was where were gonna spend the rest of their lives. And they are religious. They're part of the Christian Reformed Church, which is a Calvinist tradition prevalent amongst Dutch Americans here in the U.S. And but Kurt, really, in some ways, was rebelling against this sense that Christianity, modern Christianity, had become devoid of, first of all, bravery. Like when he read about the Jesus or the apostles or the prophets, what he saw was just these exceptionally brave people who put their lives on the line. And he said, that's not how modern Christians are. So I want to bring extreme bravery to how I manifest Christianity myself. And then, the second thing, and this is really what drives us toward the beginning of the book, is his feeling that the New Testament is much more about justice and the administration of the law than most Christians do. I think the standard interpretation is the New Testament's about, turning your cheek, loving your enemy, these sort of softer, gentler things. And he, for reasons we can get into if you're interested in, thinks it actually is more about justice and sort of laying down the law. So all of this sort of cascades to him, after spending well over a decade, maybe 15 years, doing all the normal stuff that humanitarians and missionaries do. So water and land and education and healthcare, and to a quite impressive degree, coming to this feeling that what people who want to help really should be doing is delivering justice to the poor.
Yeah, and to get more into that a little bit, when it comes to his understanding of justice, it seemed very much to be not just justice in terms of like how you described it in the softness, like of compassion for your neighbor, but in terms of justice against that impunity you were talking about. For context, from my perspective, I was raised Catholic, am Catholic, and I'm not going to change anytime soon. But one of the things that is consistently brought up is this idea that faith without works is dead. And I was wondering, how does that kind of faith of action play a role in Kurt's approach here? How did that eventually like influence his environment in Nueva Suyapa? Please forgive me if my pronunciation is terrible. My Spanish is bad. But how did that really impact his interactions with the locals and ultimately lead him to take on the gangs with Carlos Hernandez?
Yeah, actually, what you just said right there is a great segue to introduce Carlos, who's Kurt's best friend, partner, and next door neighbor in Nueva Suyapa, which is sort of this very violent, very poor neighborhood in Tegucigalpa where they both decide to live. And Carlos grew up in rural Honduras. And like Kurt and Joanne, had this very overwhelming sense of like wanting to help people, the poor, even though he himself was sort of growing up in a super poor part of Honduras. And he's evangelical. And, I mentioned sort of the theological things that Kurt was rebelling against. Carlos really rebelled against this feeling that evangelical Christianity, as it was expressed in Honduras, was way too head in the clouds. It was all praying, converting, what's going to happen to us in the afterlife. And it was very little works. And, for him, as someone who was very dedicated to his church, and that was sort of his whole social life and everything, he was, director of the choir. This sense that his church was taking the wrong approach was was almost an emotional crisis that he suffered. And, he really felt that in addition to all of those things, evangelical Christians should be helping in the here and now. So, the first really big thing he does in his life is his evangelical church in Tegucigalpa has a little healthcare clinic. So they are doing some stuff, but he takes it in a much bolder direction. He says, what is a neighborhood that is in most need of assistance? That is Nueva Suyapa, and I am going to build a school there, which is a very bold and radical and dangerous thing to do. So he builds a school, and it's not just a school, it's also a health clinic, it's a micro lender, and he moves into the neighborhood and sort of becomes like the unofficial mayor there. So he's still going to church all the time. He's still praying. He's trying to ensure that his students are good Christians, but he's also very much focused on works. And as I mentioned with Kurt, like those works are initially the typical things that humanitarians and missionaries do, but they reach a point because of all the violence happening in their neighborhood where they say, look, all this other stuff is good, but it's only going to have so much of an impact if people are scared, if businesses are getting extorted, if people are getting raped and killed and robbed. So if the police are doing nothing about that, maybe we should step in somehow.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into the context of Suyapa and how it's been, how you portrayed in the book. You mentioned that they only had one judge per 55,000 citizens, compared to the UN's recommendation of one per 4,000. The institutions in this area, what were they kind of like? Because obviously, it seems like they're remarkably weak. They're not really able to assist the people in these communities. What was Kurt and Carlos's experience when dealing with law enforcement in the area? How did that impact their approach to dealing with the gangs, and eventually, how would that impact their relationship in terms of dealing with this one gangster, Cholito?
Yeah, I think like the context you mentioned is super important for people to appreciate. And that statistic you mentioned is like quite alarming. But I still think it's hard for like Americans, for example, to grasp how under resourced the criminal justice system was down there. I mean, you go to like the offices of the prosecutors or the judiciary or the police, and like you'll see desks without computers, you'll see printers without ink, you'll see bathrooms which don't even have soap and toilet paper in them. And I mean, you might be in a city like Tegucigalpa, which maybe is one of the cities with the highest homicide rates in the world, and there might only be, I don't know, 15 to 20 homicide detectives, and they might only have access to like 2 cars, and they might not have much of a budget to buy gas money. So the system really was not functioning well. It was partly due to the under resourcing problem I just mentioned. It was partly due to corruption. And so what this meant was the city was, and places like Nueva Suyapa especially, were used to impunity. So there would be gang members, they would hurt people, they would do bad stuff. And like maybe there would be an arrest, but there would rarely be a conviction. And maybe one of these gang members would end up in prison, but maybe they would soon escape because the prison is so shoddy or the guards are so easy to bribe. And I think that one of the things that the insights that Kurt and Carlos realized from being in the neighborhood for so long is that like the real problem, the biggest one that was preventing cases from getting solved and closed, wasn't just the under resourcing problem. It was a breach in trust between the community and the criminal justice system. Because in reality, despite what we see in popular culture, where we're so used to like the ingenious detective or the CSI tech solving a case, in reality, like homicide cases are usually solved because there's a witness and that witness is willing to testify. And in Nueva Suyapa, people weren't willing to do that. I mean, first of all, because they were scared. And second of all, because they didn't trust the shoddy criminal justice system I just described to actually follow through and incarcerate the people they were scared of. So that's really what Kurt and Carlos set out to solve. And their idea, which I think was quite ingenious and bold, was to hire on their own accord a private eye, a lawyer, and a psychologist to start solving murders and other serious crimes. And, you know, that isn't something that private citizens typically do. But once you realize that solving murders usually boils down to just finding a witness, convincing the witness to testify, and keeping them alive, you realize you don't need a badge to do that. And that's really what they set out to do on the one hand. And then the other piece was like the cops didn't know who the culprits were, what they looked like, or where they lived. So this group of people that they hired, the sort of PIs for poor people, was able to gather all that information and bring witnesses and intelligence about the gangs to the cops. And then when the cops would say, great, like we want to make this arrest, but don't have a car, this secret group, as it was originally called, would say, don't worry, like we'll rent you a car, we'll gas it up, and we'll take you to where you need to be to make the arrests. And that's what they start doing. And as you know, have a pretty amazing amount of success.
So, and to kind of piggyback off of that, you mentioned keeping these witnesses alive in in an area that's so violent and also so poorly funded in terms of its police force. What were some of the challenges in protecting these witnesses? What were the challenges in also protecting Kurt and Carlos and their staff? I mean, this seems like an incredibly risky and dangerous thing to do. And not only that, but to add on to that, how did Kurt's perspective on his Christian faith influence their reaction to these threats of violence?
Yeah, I mean, to respond to the last part of that first, like both him and Carlos, as I said, they look towards the earliest Christians and they say, wow, these guys were, and women, men and women were incredibly brave So we want to be like them. We want to sort of resuscitate that lost bravery into modern Christianity. And that really emboldens them to do something which, as you rightfully point out, is so incredibly dangerous. Like, it's one thing to move into this neighborhood with your wives and children. It's another thing entirely to start doing something that is to subvert the dangerous gang that is there. And they move forward with this anyway. And yeah, they're at risk. Their staff is at risk. And obviously the witnesses are at risk. And look, they take measures to protect the witnesses, you know, some of which are quite clever. They take advantage of this sort of underutilized and buried statute in the criminal procedure code, which allows you to keep witnesses anonymous, to hide them at hearings, to disguise their names in court records. And then they'll like do things like, at one point they sew together a robe which looks exactly like a burqa, and the witnesses will wear that to testify. And they do all sorts of clever things I don't even mention in the book. Like, if the person is a very distinct height, they might put them in a wheelchair. If the person has a distinct body shape, they might put pillows underneath the robe. At a certain point, they add a voice disorder, so you can't tell what the voice sounds like. But, you know, people do get hurt, and there's collateral damage. And when gang members start getting arrested and anonymous witnesses start testifying, there are repercussions. And, you know, something very distinctive, I think, about Kurt and Carlos is that they start off and are these kind of very idealistic people, but they're also quite pragmatic. So when these snapbacks happen, when this collateral damage happens, they kind of have this steeliness about them, and they keep going. And but look, it raises some serious ethical and questions, like when you have these private individuals tampering with essentially law enforcement, and then people are getting hurt because of that. It's a serious thing, and that's just one of the sort of moral quandaries that they have to grapple with as they do this.
And to kind of again piggyback off of that as well, I think the other thing that's interesting that, and you mentioned it, is that there's collateral damage. There's an issue of the ethical dilemmas of like people, private individuals interfering with government affairs. But I also kind of note that there's I can't speak today, an issue of grief there, because when people lose their lives, when they're injured, there's an element of why did this happen? And you mentioned in the book one of their students, I believe it was the parents of one of their students, was shot, and that was one of the precipitating events that led them to get involved in this way. How did the role of grief, the role of loss, and the dangers that sometimes were fulfilled play a role in how they kind of dealt with their mission, how they came to terms with it, and really how they ultimately looked at their relationship with the locals, and perhaps how did the locals view this initiative?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. Like, to get to the point from being like ordinary humanitarians, kind of ordinary missionaries doing the stuff that we're used to seeing charity workers do, it was grief and pain that got them there, because they saw what it was like. You know, Carlos, especially, who, as I mentioned, sort of became the unofficial mayor of this community. Like, a lot of people in Nueva Suyapa don't have cars. Ambulances won't go there, certainly at night. So, like, if someone got shot in the evening, like, they would go knock, so their relative would go and knock on Carlos's door and say, "Please help me, Carlos." So this was a man who was used to waking up in the middle of the night, having to scoop up the body of a teenage boy who very well could have been a beneficiary of his charity, and take him to the hospital. And there was this big surge of violence that happened in 2003, where that was happening quite frequently. And he was carrying teenage boys to be declared dead at the hospital, and then coming home and having to wash the blood off of his clothes. I mean, at one point, he was spending so much money on coffins that he paid a carpenter to just build them inside of Genesis, which was his school. And yeah, then it hit really close to home when it actually was a classmate of Kurt's children who were all attending Carlos's school. And one of their fathers, who was by all accounts quite a good, upstanding citizen, was just shot in cold blood and killed. That really got them moving towards this sense of, we have to do something about this. And I think Kurt especially is very good at transforming these negative emotions like grief into like reasoning and thinking and focus and analysis. And I think the combination of the two of them, Carlos's understanding of the community, Kurt's analytical capabilities, both of them feeling this grief, is what manifested with the secret group and them doing something about it.
And then also, I just wanted to get into some of the development of these gangsters, the development of these people who were engaging in this violent activity. You mentioned Chalito, a 12-year-old boy who initially is actually at Genesis School. He participates in it, but he ends up getting recruited. What was some of the background surrounding him? How did he kind of become this figure that would end up being feared throughout the barrio, evading law enforcement, and really how did Kurt and Carlos kind of view this relatively terrifying figure despite his age?
Yeah, I think that was what part of what was so distinct and unusual and sort of ultimately an object of fascination to the broader Honduran community is that at the time, virtually every poor barrio in Tegucigalpa was controlled by either MS-13 or Barrio 18, which are the two big-time Central American gangs founded in Los Angeles in the 80s. And this guy Chalito and his crew called the Puchos sort of carved out their own fiefdom in Nueva Suyapa. And he was originally affiliated with the Barrio 18, but eventually just kind of went his own way and built this own gang. And I think what made him so interesting was, first of all, his youth. So there was some confusion about his age. Like people originally thought he was 12 or 13. He actually ended up being like kind of 15, 16. But even then, he was a small kid who I think just looked very young for his age. So it was like, how does this kid who's somewhere between 12 and 16 years old take control of an entire neighborhood where grown adults are terrified of him? And I think there was a alleged cruelness to him in terms of his willingness to hurt people, to kill people. But then there was also this like strategic ability that this gang had. For example, they saw that the prior gangs had sort of been wiped out by vigilantes and cops. So one of the first things that they do is they basically go to door and confiscate people's firearms. And, you know, by the time the book starts, he's certainly not a sympathetic character. But if you rewind the clock and look at his life, I mean, he grew up in like the poorest corner of Nueva Suyapa, with a father who was not there. And at a very young age, I mean, he looks like he might have went to school, maybe first grade, maybe second grade, tried that a couple times. So pretty early on was working or trying to earn money to feed himself. And, you know, that morphed into sort of low level thievery and stealing. And it might have stayed there, but this gang culture I mentioned before, which had come from Los Angeles, really changed things around the time he was coming of age. And, you know, he graduated to much more serious criminality. And, you know, his journey is fascinating because when the book starts, he's this already scary figure, but he eventually ends up taking part in the murder of an American DEA agent, at which point he becomes, you know, one of the most famous and legendary criminals in Honduras. And you know, by that point in time, the secret group had already gathered a fair amount of intel on him, and they were able to be very helpful in eventually getting him arrested.
And this is where I think it's ultimately tragic, the environment that these people are growing up in. It's not simply just that there are dangerous criminals, but that there's a cycle of recruitment and exploitation that was consistently a problem. And I was wondering, when it comes to that cycle, that kind of environment, what were some of the strategies that Kurt and Carlos really approached to try and handle that as best they could? How did they try and protect their students from that? Really, how did they themselves emotionally deal with it? Because to see somebody like 15 or 12 getting involved in criminal activity, that's not normal for anybody to witness.
Yeah, and I think these were the frustrations that really changed Kurt and Carlos and made them into these kind of justice seekers versus like charity doers. Look, that really became Carlos's main challenge running the school once the Barrio 18 and MS-13 came into the city. You know, all teenage, probably boys especially, have their rebellions all across the world and they manifest in different ways. But when it's participating in a gang, that's permanent. There's kind of no coming back from that. And Carlos like gave his heart and soul into trying to prevent that from happening. I mean, not just in terms of running the school and trying to keep kids there and showing up for classes, which sometimes wasn't easy. Sometimes these kids wouldn't show up because they were embarrassed that they didn't have shoes. So he would have to go to their house, buy them a new pair of shoes, and bring them to school, because he would know if they weren't at school and they were on the streets hanging out, then they might get involved in bad things. And it continued, sort of after the bell had rung. So he would be there late at night with the kids playing soccer, organizing obstacle courses, setting up volleyball games. And, there was a limited capacity in the school. So he would create programming to include more kids. There was a whole series of camps he did in the summer where he'd bus hundreds of kids out to cabins in the woods, and they would spend, a week or two playing games. And, all of this had a Christian and evangelical tinge to it. So really trying to teach these kids good values. But inevitably, like, some kids just slipped through the cracks. And some of those kids whose bodies he was taking to the hospital were kids who had been part of his programs. And then, like, I think another thing that makes his story really fascinating is, like, a lot of these gang members were kids he knew. Like, he knew their families, he knew their mothers, like they had been in the gymnasium playing games. So it's like there was an intimacy at all. And there was ultimately like a real sensitivity. It wasn't just like, we need to get these guys arrested. It was also then became like, the prisons they were sending them to were quite horrible. So like, how do we make these prisons just more humane and be like somewhat rehabilitative? So that becomes another journey and part of the book, as you know.
Yeah, and then the other side of this is I do kind of wonder, like you keep mentioning that they started out pretty idealistic, but they ended up becoming very pragmatic people. I was wondering, were there moments where they had crises of faith? Were there issues of quitting this secret group when things got really difficult for them, or were there moments where ultimately they decided that they could push on? And really, how did they deal with the emotional stress? Because I can't emphasize enough like how strange it is from the American perspective to see all this suffering, to willingly go into this environment. Like, even Carlos left a teaching job to be in this environment to do this kind of work. So I'm just curious, like, how did they on a personal level deal with that emotional strain?
Yeah, I think, my mind is jumping to a certain point in the book where, like, you see them over and over again kind of like get away with taking these huge risks. Like, there is collateral damage, but none of it kind of like breaks them. It certainly upsets them and is something they certainly have to grapple with, but they just are living in a place where there's so much violence happening that, like, it doesn't probably rattle them in a way it might rattle you or me, who's not used to living in a neighborhood where that's just like happening all the time. But eventually, one of their employees is assassinated. And, there were a lot of warning signs beforehand that this person's life was at risk, but they just kept going because they're the type of people who are risk takers. They're the type of people who have this sort of philosophical commitment to bravery. And this really devastates them and forces them to totally reevaluate themselves and their lives. And they really do have to step away, go out of the country for a little bit and reflect on, like, do we need to change our approach and everything? And it really does change them. And I think before that, ASJ, which is the charity they run, is this sort of like ragtag, informal, kind of like under the radar organization. They're very blasé about security. But once that happens, it really changes. They get really serious about security. They and their charity starts using bodyguards. And there's just like a institutionalization and formalization of everything they're doing. And I think that really marked a transformative moment for them. And then just to talk about the personal toll, I mean, a fascinating part in the book and their story happens when sort of soon after this assassination, Kurt is basically having a tough time getting out of bed in the morning. And his wife, Joanne, insists that he sees a psychiatrist, and he doesn't tell anyone about it, but the psychiatrist prescribes an SSRI. And meanwhile, Carlos, who has sort of become the face of the organization, largely because he's Honduran, is the one who's in charge of telling this assassinated employee's stories. He's actually traveling to Europe, to the US. His life is now under threat as well. And at a certain point, he goes to Kurt and he goes, Kurt, I got to tell you something. I've been not well. So I started taking this SSRI. And Kurt goes, no way. I've been taking the exact same medication. So that's a moment where you really feel the toll that all this has taken on them.
Yeah, and a lot of the conversation in these kinds of contexts tends to focus on these individuals, and some of our interview has been on that. But I was wondering, you mentioned also how Kurt, despite the strain and early on, has a very aware perspective. He's very hesitant to engage in this almost like white savior complex approach. You mentioned how he's very cognizant of the role of previous Western perspectives and Western personalities, assuming that they're going to be doing good for these people when in reality they're engaging in exploitation. How did that kind of approach influence the way they interacted with the people there? How did the people perceive them in the way they interacted? And really, how did that impact the larger mission as well as the emotional toll that you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think that very much shaped Kurt. This sense that he wanted to be different from the other gringos who, in his opinion, had done damage to Honduras, or maybe in the more modern ones, like the other people who, like, he was very critical of a lot of the ways that people helped Honduras. For example, one thing him and his wife were very critical of were like the short term mission groups who would come down for 2 or 3 weeks to build a house. If you include all of the costs of like the flights and the hotels and everything else, it might have cost like 100 grand. And a local Honduran contractor could have built that house for $3,000 or something. So I think they were critical of that, like sort of in an economic sense, but also in the sense that like those people didn't really know Honduras before they set out to help it. And he was very committed to this sense of like, I have to live here. I have to be committed to this country to even start to think about helping. So that's really what drove this decision, which truly was quite a radical and controversial thing to do, to like move to Nueva Suyapa. That's not where expats in Honduras typically stay. Most expats stay in like kind of middle class, upper middle class, gated communities. But he's like, if we're gonna help, we have to live like the people we're trying to help. So I think that's sort of one of the ways that he addresses that. And it even extends to like he could have sent his kids to like the fancy bilingual private school where most expats send their kids, and he doesn't do that. Like him and his wife Joanne decide to send the kids to the local school that Carlos runs. So that's his big reaction. And I think, yeah, like he ends up really integrating himself with the community. I mean, he's very integrated into his church and helping all the people involved in that. ASJ has done so much to help Nueva Suyapa, not just sort of these dramatic justice-y things we're mentioning, but also like improving the water system and like helping with land titling. So as far as I can tell, like he's pretty well respected and liked in the community. And but it is interesting because like, when they do become a much larger organization, a more public-facing organization, a more political organization, he sort of fades into the background. And it's really Carlos who becomes the face. And I think that's him acknowledging kind of what you're alluding to, that like, this is a Honduran organization and a Honduran should be the front man. But in reality, they're partners, and they've been for quite a long time.
Yeah, and you mentioned this, and I'm glad you did. You mentioned Kurt's children and how they were interacting with this. Obviously, there's a lot of risk raising a family in this kind of environment. But in terms of like safety for them, how was like Kurt handling that kind of experience? Because obviously children would become a target in that environment. Were there any concerns that the gangs would go after them? Was there any concern that ultimately that might push the organization to the side, threats to family and things like that? And then on another note, when it comes to the role of the Honduran people interacting with this group, what was their perspective in seeing this organization form from the beginning and to its eventual zenith?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I should mention is like this secret group, this sort of like solving homicides initiative they started, it was clandestine. So it wasn't like they were announcing it with signs around the community. So they did hire these people. These people were knocking on doors. Kurt and Carlos were introducing them to potential informants and witnesses, but it was kind of all done, undercover. So, but inevitably, like, they were talking to those witnesses, they were talking to like police and prosecutors. So there was some chance that the information would leak out. But, that was just a risk that they decided to take. They and the kids like led a pretty normal life. I mean, they weren't super guarded. The kids would walk to school. They would all walk to church on Sundays. So I don't think they let it affect them. They didn't live in fear. They didn't live like too cautiously, which, as we've been saying over and over again, I think is just another example of like how unusual they are. And, fortunately the kids were not heard. They were totally like separate from this whole process. But I think it's just another amazing element of the story, and that they did all this stuff with their wives and kids living in the neighborhood.
To move on to the reception of the book and really the legacy that this story has kind of established, how has your own experience interviewing these people, including, I think you mentioned in the book that Cholito, you also interviewed him. Um, how has your experience and the reception to this book kind of influenced your perspective on Honduras? What is something you would like Americans to take away from this book, and really the larger picture of of good charity work, really?
Man, I think there's so many lessons. Like, I think I certainly agree with this sense that, like, there's this huge infrastructure like to help the poor around all the things that we know, and I think there's very little charity or like money or aid that's dedicated to like justice. And I really do sort of believe in the sense that like that has to be established in order for a place to prosper. And that if that's not there, if the police aren't there, if the justice system isn't there, those things are all going to suffer. So like I think their central hypothesis is a good one, and I hope it challenges some other people around the world to like think about like, can we do something similar, or is there a way to like try to, even if we're not going to get involved in solving homicides ourselves, is there some way we can make the police work better and less corruptly, wherever you are in the world. And look, I think it's just another example of just like people who bring creativity and bravery to a problem, and I hope that's inspiring to some people. And then the last thing I'll say is like we as Americans are just so used to seeing Hondurans only through the lens of like the border or like deportations. And like there's so much coverage and focus on that, and that there obviously should be. But I feel like we rarely get a really nuanced portrayal of like what life is like down there. And I think I hope this book contributes to that. And I think anyone who's interested in learning more about these countries, this book I hope will be educational. And I think just to sort of tie it all back to like the beginning, there are versions of these problems. They're not quite as extreme in places like Chicago and St. Louis and Oakland, with there being too much impunity because witnesses won't testify. And the reasons are the same. It's because they're afraid of retribution and they don't trust the criminal justice system. So these guys found a way to resolve that problem, to bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement in a place where like the problems were frankly way worse. So that gives me hope that like these problems could be resolved here with some creativity and maybe with something like the secret group.
And into my final question, and part of the reason this story interested me so much wasn't just the bravery, but also the role of Christianity outside of the lens of a purely Western perspective. Christianity is ultimately a world religion. In your overall experience, both in creating this book and in interviewing these people and their interactions with this violence, what really is the ultimate legacy of Christianity in this story? What is its role in terms of not just how the people themselves perceive it living this day to day, but also people from the outside looking in?
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the book. It's all over the story, and partly because it's all over Honduras. Like Honduras is a very Christian country. Like I think 90% of Hondurans are Christian. At this point, it's about half Catholic, half Protestant. 20, 30 years ago, it was almost entirely Catholic. So that's been a major shift that's happened. And I mean, there's just so many examples of it coming into play in the story. Like, first of all, there's all the theological, sort of more philosophical things I mentioned that drive Kurt and Carlos's behavior. And for them, like, it's really concrete. Like, these are people who look at the Bible, look at scripture, talk about it, and that affects what they do day to day. I mean, this charity, every Monday morning, they have a devotional, they all get together, they pray, they sing Christian songs, they sort of parse scripture, and they do that first thing Monday morning because it affects the decisions that they make throughout the week. And I think their connection to the church and these values is part of what gave these witnesses, these informants, the confidence to trust these people. It was the fact that these people talking to them weren't some cop who they didn't trust. They were people who were affiliated with this sort of Christian charity, and I think that had an effect. And then, towards the end of the book, where Kurt and Carlos gain this huge amount of political power, to the point where they're able to purge the police force in the country, like fire half of the cops on the force, and do a lot of other sort of anti-corruption type maneuvers. Part of the reason they have this moral authority with the public is because they ally with the head of the Protestant church in the country. So they're affiliated with the church. But I think, what makes them interesting is they're not just like religious actors. They're also always bringing in like academic knowledge and sort of analysis. So it's this fusion of analysis, sociology, religion that I think has helped them a lot along the way.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. The book is Bear Witness, The Pursuit of Justice in a Violent Land. Buy it wherever you buy your books. And thanks again, Ross, for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. This is awesome.